If you're talking about it, I'll be talking about it. Dennis Prager here. Join me this morning at 11, right here on AM 560, The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. So on Friday night, General Dunford, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Secretary of Defense Mattis explained the policy and legal framework for the strikes in Syria. Mattis doing that part. Dunford explaining the military outcomes. Here's Mattis on the frameworks.
As our Commander-in-Chief, the President has the authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to use military force overseas to defend important United States national interests. The United States has vital national interests in averting a worsening catastrophe in Syria and specifically deterring the use and proliferation of chemical weapons. Earlier today, President Trump directed the U.S. military to conduct operations in consonance with our allies to destroy the Syrian regime's chemical weapons research, development, and production capability. Tonight, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States took decisive action to strike the Syrian chemical weapons infrastructure. Clearly, the Assad regime did not get the message last year. This time, our allies and we have struck harder. Together, we have sent a clear message to Assad and his murderous lieutenants that they should not perpetrate another chemical weapons attack for which they will be held accountable. The 70 nations in the Defeat ISIS coalition remain committed to defeating ISIS in Syria. The strike tonight separately demonstrates international resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used on anyone under any circumstance in contravention of international law.
So I guess if sending a message and defending Obama's red line was the limit of the mission, then President Trump was right to say mission accomplished. That's not my sense of it, though. And I think using that phrase in particular is problematic. But by the way, bombings on the rebel strongholds and including civilian populations by the Assad regime resumed on Sunday,
right? Less
than 48 hours later. So what exactly are we accomplishing? And
why didn't we target any Russian or Iranian assets?
And should the president have sought congressional authorization before green lighting the strike? For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Peter Roskam. Of course, he is our Republican representative from the 6th Congressional District in the Western Burbs. Peter, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Dan and Amy, good to be with you guys this morning.
So what about the president's decision and the strike on Syria?
Well, I think it was a good move insofar as it was decisive. It was clear. There was no ambiguity about it. He signaled to the Russians what was going to be happening, so no excuse for their surprise. And I think it was very important that the allies, particularly the UK and France, be involved in it. So it was a good move. Is it decisive? Is it done? Of course not. There's a huge opportunity as it relates to the Iran question right now, because the Iranians have been clearly funding the Assad regime, and now we're in this discussion about the Iran deal in particular, and the Europeans are, of course, wringing their hands about it. Now is an opportunity for the Trump administration to reach out to the European capitals and say, look, we've got to isolate even if you don't like the JCPOA changes that we're proposing, now is the time to isolate the Iranian regime because they're complicit in the chemical warfare attacks and get off the dime. So I think there's an opportunity here that goes beyond simply the missile strikes.
Well, President Trump is going to be spending the week in Mar-a-Lago. He's going to be meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister later this week. But do you think he will try and reach out and have that conversation, or will that be left up to the State Department?
I think it's going to be left up to the diplomats, but that's not a bad thing in particular. At this point, I don't think it's really risen to the presidential level. On this whole question about the May 12th date, on the pulling the plug on the flawed Iranian deal, there's only two things I think that are gonna change that. One is if Congress puts something on his desk that would change it, and I don't think that's likely. And the second thing is if the Europeans come with a signed deal, with a real proposal. And I think the Europeans are they're kind of all over the place on this. They would much rather that we do nothing vis-a-vis Iran, and I think that we can really take advantage and drive this and point out to the Europeans the entity that you want to do business with, that is the mullahs in Iran, are complicit in this in the chemical weapons attack. You don't get to be scandalized by the chemical weapons attack and continue to do business with their suitors.
Yeah, but I don't understand what the end game is here, even with trying to leverage Iran on that unholy nuclear deal that the Obama administration cut with the mullahs. So we're going to say what? We're going to continue pounding sites in Syria if you don't come to the table and renegotiate the terms of the nuclear deal so that we can convince the Europeans? Or are we going to concede that and go after regime change in Syria? Or are we just going to continue this kind of 7 years of muddled policy that's resulted in 500,000 deaths and 10 million displacements while also enabling both Iranian hegemony in the region as well as Russian involvement? I mean, this. I don't get any of this.
Right. I understand what you're asking. So in my view, these are operating on parallel tracks, but there's an opportunity. The parallel tracks are, the one is the muddled approach that you just described that's been a disaster basically in Syria and has, just resulted in heartache. So there's not a lot of good choices here. And to sit back and let the chemical weapons attack happen with impunity, we can't do that, clearly. But we've got a limitation in what we're able to do. Okay, I will stipulate that. My point is that look at the opportunity here vis-a-vis the Iranian threat. The Iranian threat is a super aggressive threat, obviously, in the Middle East. The Iranians are nearly maniacal in how they're approaching this. In light of that, we've got an opportunity to decouple their support from the Europeans, and I say take advantage of that. Press hard on it.
Okay.
All right, switching gears. Got to ask you a domestic policy question before we get to the Republican leadership question with Ryan's announcement, and that is that $1.3 trillion omnibus spending bill, including such highlights as funding for Planned Parenthood. You voted for that. Why?
So the Planned Parenthood question has all of the Hyde protection. So there's nothing new here. So it's the fungible question. I get it.
But But I mean, just a point of order. Ryan's commitment was to defund Planned Parenthood. Paul Ryan's commitment.
Yeah, I mean, so was Trump's.
Yes,
so was
right.
Pence's. I mean,
right.
You asked why I voted for it. I voted for it because it's got the Hyde protections in it, which has been the traditional pro-life view. The other reason I voted for it was the military is in desperate need of support. It has been hollowed out. You know these stories better than I do. And the idea of not funding the military was completely unacceptable to me. So we're in it's a mixed bag. The United States Senate is unwilling to walk away from the Senate filibuster rule, which means Senate Democrats are at the table, which means you've got to negotiate with them.
I wanted to ask you about President Trump. Did you watch the interview last night between George Stephanopoulos and James Comey?
I missed it. What did I miss?
Nothing.
A bunch of girls talking to each other. But one thing that, when it comes to the importance of this Russian investigation, he said that he may have obstructed justice, and also too by asking him to drop the Flynn investigation. Do you where do you see this Russian investigation going, especially now that a former FBI director spoke about it on national television?
Yeah, I think this is one of these things that people are looking at, desperately trying to come up with something. The goalposts are continuing to move, and now this is an investigation that has gone far and wide. I think the Mueller investigation should wind up whenever it's appropriate to wind up. Bring charges if there's charges to bring. If not, close the books and turn the page.
Concurrent to this, over the weekend, you had the release of the Inspector General's FBI Inspector General's report that details painstakingly how Andy McCabe, the deputy director, Comey's chief lieutenant, lied and lied and lied and used his position to advance his and his wife's personal political and reputational interests at the expense of the FBI's law enforcement interests. And it seems to me this is a story that needs to really be amplified by congressional Republicans.
Yeah, I think there's a larger story here too, and it's this parallel track. You know, the three of us over the years have talked a lot about the IRS, and the IRS used to have this reputation of being tough but fair and so forth, and the shine is completely off of that penny. And the tragedy in this whole thing is now the self-inflicted reputational damage that has resulted by the FBI being so political on some of these questions. And it is corrosive, ultimately, because if people lose confidence in the integrity of law enforcement and rule of law, that doesn't end well for any of us.
I got to ask you a political question, too. Your race, I've seen rated by some of the prognosticators, such as they are, rated a toss-up, which is not a usual position for the 6th Congressional District in Illinois. And you understand what the landscape is and how depressed conservatives are in particular, particularly as the Rauner/Donner party continues to their attempted purge of conservatives from the Republican Party. What's your path to victory if you don't get base turnout in the suburbs?
It's the same path as I had in 2006. I've seen this before. As you recall, my first opponent was Tammy Duckworth. It was a very tough year for the GOP. George W. Bush was very unpopular. The war was very unpopular. And I was running against someone with a very compelling personal story based on her sacrifice and so forth. So my view is don't underestimate the environment. I think I represent a constituency that wants to get things done, not just, argue in Congress, and they want someone who's effective and reflects their views. And I've done that, and I will be looking forward to the rest of the campaign.
Well, that's true. And in 2006, you had an unpopular Bush. You also had Judy Bartopinka manage all of 39% of the vote against Rod Blagojevich under federal investigation at the time. So I guess if you can win in that environment, you can win in this one. He is Peter Roskam. He is congressman for the 6th Congressional in the Western Burbs. Peter, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is the morning.